our first speaker of the session. Each speaker will speak for 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of discussion. First speaker of the day is Professor Ingo Kottsieper of the University of Münster. He's also a research associate in the Göttingen Academy of Sciences and Humanities in the Qumran Digital Project. He is on the steering committee of the Scripta Qumranica Electronica. He's a partner of the project of the Sabian Dictionary, in general an authority on Semitic epigraphy and languages. The topic of his lecture this morning, today, is from Yahat Tzva'ot to Yeho Marashemaya, aspects of religious development in Elephantine. So.
Just switch on the we need the slides. It's coming. There we are. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, let me first thank the organizers and especially GARD for the wonderful idea of organizing excellently conducting such a colloquium in memory of Professor Shaul Shaket. It is a special pleasure for me to be able to present some reflections on Yahoo and his worshippers at Elephantine on such an occasion. Although the documents available to us on the Yahoo community on Elephantine cover a period of well over a century, the diachronic aspect of the development of religious history on Elephantine surprisingly plays only a minor role in research. At most, some researchers have considered possible developments in the status of the Yahoo community in the context of the appearance of Hanania and the well-known conflict over the Yahoo temple. The fact that diachronic considerations played such a minor role is certainly due to the fact that hardly any religious or cultic texts have survived, and thus the religious life of the Yahoo community can mostly only be inferred by indirect remarks. However, as I hope to show in this paper, a diachronic evaluation of these references certainly points to a development within the Yahoo community. That a development is to be expected in a living community over such a long period of more than 100 years is not only to be expected a priori, but is also shown by manifold observations of general history of religion. Before I dedicate myself to the text, however, I would like to deal with the question when, at the latest, a Yahoo community on Elephantine had been established. Especially in this part, I thank God for a paper which was published, which was really thought-provoking, and so I not only always come to the same conclusions, but thank you very much. It was great for me. The terminus ante quem is of course given by the direction of the Yahoo temple. That this temple was already built before Cambyses on Elephantine is assumed by most researchers and should hardly be doubted. One main argument, of course, is that not only the Yahoo community in the context of the dispute with the Achaemenid administration states this. Such a claim would have been completely abstruse and counterproductive if the temple had been built under Persian suzerainty and thus with the knowledge and obviously consent of the very same administration. Here the well-known bureaucratic character of this administration must not be forgotten, which, as not only documents from Elephantine prove, kept book even about small legal decisions. And we are not dealing with the building of a garden hut, but of a temple. Should the Yahoo worshippers really could expect that such a blatant lie to the administration remained undiscovered? And should they have taken the associated risk of jeopardizing their entire project if this false claim could be debunked by a quick glance into the files? Even more, if the Yao community had built their temple under Achaemenid rule, and then probably with academite authorization, would it not have been much more effective to point out the Persian administration that the Chnum priest had attacked a temple authorized by that administration? The restoration would have been then not other than to put Achaemenid legal title again into execution. But this view about the age of the temple was also shared by the Achaemenid administration themselves. Thus, even the Achaemenid governors Bagoi and Dalaya, in their recommendation to Arshamus, to the satrap, to allow the reconstruction of the temple, present alone this information, no other information, as an argument. And Arshamus follows this recommendation, obviously accepting their view of the historical background of the temple. When the temple was built exactly, however, cannot ultimately be said with certainty. However, recent interpretations of the excavation results at Elephantine, together with the stele of Nesher, would point to the Said period. Von Pilgrim, the excavator, has recently clarified that the Egyptian temple precinct of Elephantine was demarcated to the northwest during the Said period by a massive wall. This wall. Running between the Chnum temple precinct and the Jao temple. However, Von Pilgrim assumes that the space between the central building of the Jao temple and this boundary wall would have been largely filled by the street of the king and the parallel processional way of Chnum. So he says there was two ways, parallels, running between this. This would mean that the temple building of the Yao temple directly adjoined this public space without a clear demarcation, which, as pointed out by von Pilgrim himself, would be very unusual. At this point, nevertheless, he brings back into play his earlier hypothesis, which was actually based on a now obsolete interpretation of the walls southeast of the Yao temple. Though his interpretations of those walls he completely changed, he still assumes that the temple precinct of the Yao temple was later extended to the southeast and thus into the streets. So this was something built here on the street. Thus he argues that, I quote, an enclosure wall east of the temple of Yao would have been reducing the width of this most important street or even blocking it completely. This would have led to a legal dispute that ultimately ended in the devastation of the temple in 410 BC. This interpretation is unconvincing for several reasons. First, there is simply no archaeological evidence of an additional southeastern wall of the Yao sanctuary. There's nothing here. There's empty space. Between the northwestern enclosure wall of the Egyptian temple district and the actual temple building of the Yao sanctuary, the excavators could not find anything indicating an intervening boundary wall. Second, if nevertheless the road by the Yao sanctuary would have been blocked, so the question arises when this should have happened. It is hardly conceivable that first in the Said time, the Egyptians themselves would have permitted this and tolerated it over 100 years, only to act against it in 410. Thus, this problem would have to arise then in Persian time by building measures. However, such a building measure takes time and could not be accomplished without knowledge of the administration. So we would expect the protest having arisen already with the first groundbreaking. And if it had been an illegal building measure, this would have been terminated with the help of the administration already at the beginning. You don't let them build a wall and then say, oh, put them away. But why did the Egyptians wait until they could carry out an action against the whole temple with the help of a subaltern official, Vidranga, which, as a consequences for this Vidranga show, could not be justified? Third, even if there had been such an extension and it had been illegal, it would have been legally appropriate in such a case only to remove this extension and not to damage the entire sanctuary in such a way that the cult come to a standstill. That this is also expected accordingly under Egyptian law is suggested by the Codex Hermopolis West, in which in such cases certainly also preserves the rights of the defendant. Thus, the defendant has the right to recover his building material, even in the case of a building erected on someone else's private property. And the regulation regarding a building that extends onto a public road obviously refer only to this extended area, but not to buildings still located on non-public area. That is, later buildings of the temple that blocked the road should have been removed, but the actual temple should not have been damaged. In short, not only there is no archaeological evidence that at any time the Yahweh sanctuary illegally blocked the king's road and the path of Chnum, but the assumption that such an illegal blockade occurred at some point in this is historically implausible. The whole problem, however, hinges on the assumptions that at the time of the Yahweh sanctuary, a road still ran between it and the Chnum district, and was in use as a royal road or processional way. The arguments for the existence of such a road, speaking now of this part of the road, is based on the unproven assumption that the road, which is attested for the earlier time at this place, was still in use in the late Said period, and was not affected by the construction measures that led to the erection of the enclosure of the Chnum sanctuary and the Yahweh temple. Only on the basis of this assumption, the argument of von Pilgrim is comprehensible that due to the ground conditions at the southeastern side of the wall of the Chnum district, a street must not be assumed, so that this street must run along its northwestern flank. So the argument from Pilgrim is there must be a road. We don't know why, but there must be a road because in earlier times there was a road. Surely there is no road here on the eastern side, so it must be there. That's the argument. Von Pilgrim argues against the assumption proposed already by Quack that the procession way of the Chnum ran within the Egyptian temple district, that the term way of Chnum is still used in Persian time for the localization of houses in the Aramaic quarter. It must have been visible from outside and thus located northeastern of the wall. Otherwise, rather the wall would have been mentioned as a geographical marker. However, this argument overlooks that the fact that in the Aramaic documents, the way of Chnum is mentioned only in the context of building complex located northeast of the temple. The documents B3, 4, and 5 prove that the road of the king and the way of Chnum ran side by side before they met the area of the Yahweh temple. At this point, however, the road of the king then turned northwest and continued northeast of the temple, then ran as a way of the king along the northwestern flank of the temple. So we only have for this part the designation to there. And the way of king runs around the temple. This is clear. On the other hand, the documents prove a way of God, this one, way of God, which is to be looked for northeast of the mentioned building complex and is obviously identical with the road which, according to the results of the excavation there, branches off in southeastern direction from the way of Chnum into the area of the sanctuary. But about the space between the Yao sanctuary and the temple district of Chnum, the sources say nothing. This archaeological and descriptional evidence speaks, in my opinion, clearly for the fact that for the building of the Yao temple, the old street was given up. The street of the king was led around as a street or way of the king, that allowed the temple, but the procession way of the Chnum was led over the way of God into the temple district of Chnum. So before there was this street, when this wall was built, and obviously the temple too, and the street of king goes around this, and the way of Chnum goes around this, into the temple district. This assumption also removes a difficulty not mentioned by von Pilgrim. Why would the Egyptians build a massive wall that would exclude the procession wall, the way of Chnum, from his sacred precinct? And would one have built a Yahweh temple directly at such a processional wall way without providing for a separation? This would not be very likely, as already von Pilgrim mentioned, neither from the cult topographical perspective of the Yao community, nor from the Egyptian point of view. But why was this massive wall built in the Said period in the first place? Von Pilgrim considers that with it the holy district of the Chnum should be separated clearly from the Aramaic quarter. The problem with this assumption is that this quarter was not developed until Persian times. So they first built the wall and waited what to come. The closest explanation, however, is that the wall was meant to separate the Chnum sanctuary from the newly built or expanded Yahweh sanctuary. This explains then also the absence of an own enclosure of the Yahweh sanctuary in direction to the southeast. It is there. It was de facto given by the new enclosure wall of the Chnum precinct. So this is for both. Therefore, there is some evidence that either the construction of the Yahweh temple or at least a significant extension of a possible already longer existing smaller sanctuary is to be put in connection with the enclosure wall of the Egyptian holy district. Since the latter is dated in the Said period and closer probably in the time of Amazi, also the construction or at least the extension of the Yahweh temple might be dated in this time. Here, however, the question arises why this sanctuary was built or expanded at this time, especially since the expansion of the Aramaic quarter happened much later. At this point, the statue of Nestor comes into play. The inscription on the back reports, among other things, about conflicts with the mercenaries stationed on Elephantine and in Syene, which also included people from the Levant. These had evidently rebelled, whatever this meant in detail is not said, and threatened to defect to the Nubians. Nestor, who was in charge of Upper Egypt at the time, emphasizes that he was able to prevent this change of sites, which would have been fatal for the protection of the southern border. In doing so, he left further action to the pharaoh, whose reaction, however, has not been preserved. However, only 2 or 3 hieroglyphs are missing here, and the formulation, what was done by His Majesty, was there, 2 signs, leaves many possibilities open. In any case, one will agree with the conclusion of the last editor of the inscription, Hussein Basir, that, I quote, Neshor was able to reach a reasonable solution accepted by all parties at Elephantine and stop the revolt of Apries foreign mercenaries, end of quote. This event teaches that the mercenaries in South Egypt were a power factor and the Egyptians did well to secure their loyalty. A revolt or withdrawal of the mercenaries to the south would have severely compromised Egypt's security. And Neshor's actions indicate that they were well aware of the need to resolve conflicts with mercenaries diplomatically. From this point of view, it would be understandable that perhaps still in the time of Apries, at the latest, however, under Amasis, one tried to bind mercenary groups also by cultic concessions to oneself and to secure thereby their loyalty. This could have been the background for the permission of the Yao community to build a temple near the area of the holy district of Elephantine or to extend an already existing smaller sanctuary massively, whereby this was in order not to annoy the Chnum community too much, separated by a massive wall from their holy district. Be that as it may, the previous observations speak for the fact that the Yao sanctuary was established at latest under Amasis, whereby the probably connected construction of the enclosure wall of the Egyptian temple district suggests that this was seen rather critically on the part of the Chnum priesthood already at that time. The earlier history of the Yao community associated with this temple remains obscure. Neither can we say whether it was fed by a single or different waves of bigger groups of immigrants, or whether it was established locally by mercenaries who reached Syene and Elephantine, one by one, or as small groups of families over a longer period of time. The normal way of thinking is there was a big group coming there, or several waves. But we don't know this. They could have come one mercenary after the others, and if they have form a critical mass, then they can create a community. We know this from migrations from all over the world. Be that as it may, the early Aramaic documents found at Elephantine also indicate a pre-Persian origin for the Yao community, with the later documents bearing witness to a gradual modernization or assimilation of the community to the new Persian supremacy. This is particularly clear in the designation of the deity itself. It is significant that in the ostraca of Elephantine from the first quarter of the 5th century BC, the name of God is always written with he at the end, where it is attested 12 times in contrast to the expected Aramaic orthography, which would demand a Vav at the end, but is not yet found at this time. The spelling with he occurs last again in the years 449 and 446 with one and the same scribe, Nathan bar Ananya. He was very old at this point, at this time. In contrast, the oldest datable spelling with Vav occurs only in 464 in document B22. This, however, was written in Syene, not in Elephantine, in Syene, by Ituba'aba, or how you spell it, who probably did not belong to the Yao community. The suffix o or u in ito or itu is otherwise consistently encountered in Egyptian and Persian names and sporadically in Aramaic, but is not attested in the Hebrew onomasticon in Egypt, and is also rather uncommon elsewhere. A good parallel, for example, can be found in the name element it, or which is widespread in Egyptian names, and of which even names as Itu, Itau are attested. The patronymic Abba, Ebba, Oba, what you want, cannot be found in the Hebrew onomastica either, but it would have its demotic counterpart in Ebbe or Abba, Panther, which is not only frequently attested as a named element, but is also found as a name for persons in this short form. The next datable evidence for the spelling of Yahoo with Vav is found only in 451 BC in a document written by the obvious Aramaic or Babylonian scribe Buniba Manuki. The two remaining documents before 450 cannot be dated exactly, but they certainly or very probably belong to the time after 475, and at least A33 comes from Lower Egypt, from a totally different area. Thus, 437 BC, from 437 BC on, however, the spelling with Vav is generally used also on Elephantine, whereby it is particularly interesting that also the scribe Mausya bar Nathan, the son, and according to his handwriting, also the pupil of Nathan bar Ananya, who in some years ago before used the he, adopts the newer spelling in contrast to his father. So he learned by his father, but though he learned from his father, he said, no, father, I write it now with Vav and not with he. Thus it can be assumed that in the Yahoo community, the name of God Yahoo was originally written with he at the end, which was soon replaced by scribes outside the community with Vav, according to the orthography they were familiar with. This modernized spelling was then also generally received by scribes from the Yahoo community only after 450. The spelling with he is certainly due to an Israelite Judean tradition, in which the spelling of final O with he was common until the 6th century, while this is foreign and has always been foreign to Aramaic, with one exception. And this exception confirms this rule truly and not only as a figure of speech. Namely, it is found in the pre-imperial Aramaic letter of King Adon of Ekron, we are in Palestine, written in the late 7th century BC. He wrote a letter to the Pharaoh and wrote the Egyptian word Pharaoh also with final he. Here, obviously, the scribe in Ekron also resorted to the orthography prevailing in his Palestine environment for this non-Aramaic word. In any case, such a spelling was foreign to the strongly regulated Imperial Aramaic, which is then also reflected in the fact that Yahoo as a component of personal names can be found even before 475, written with Vav. It is obvious, however, that in the spelling of personal names, the usual orthography can adapted or must be adapted faster, especially if the correct reading of the name and thereby also the identification of the person needs to be secured. The old spelling with he, no Aramaic had said Yahozu, he had said Yaha, but this would be wrong. The conservative adherence to the traditional non-Aramaic spelling with he, in case of the god names standing alone, becomes clear, however, from the fact that even in such personal names, this spelling is encountered occasionally before 475 and possibly even afterwards. The observation on the spelling of the name Yahoo finds their parallel in the observations on the use of Sabaoth. The designation of Yahoo as Yahoo Sabaoth is found only in the Ostraka from the first quarter of the 5th century BC. That Sabaoth is a Hebraism is clear. The word is not found elsewhere in Aramaic, apart from later clear adoptions from Hebrew, and belong to the root davar, as evidenced especially by Old South Arabian and the early languages of the North Arabian region, such as Safaetic and Taimanite. Thus, it would have to appear in Aramaic as Kaba'at or Abad. If therefore the designation Yahweh Tsabaoth is certainly the Hebrew designation of God, well known from the Tanakh, the question arises also as to the defective spelling of the name, Tsabaoth. According to Imperial Aramaic orthography, one would expect a Vav before the Tav. However, since already in the case of name of God Yahweh, the scribes retained the old Hebrew orthography, according to which until the 6th century the ending Od was written defectively, the entire term Yahweh Tsabaoth here is in the traditional Hebrew spelling. Thus, it is not necessary to assume a partial phonetic alignment with Aramaic for Tsabaoth as spoken as Sabaat. Only in passing it should be noted that these observations speak of course for the fact that the Yahweh community still had access to Hebrew texts, which were available in the orthography of the 7th or 6th century BC. Otherwise, it is difficult to imagine where the scribes on Elephantine should have gotten the idea to write example given Yahoo, not as usual with Vav, but with a He, totally uncommon in Aramaic. What kind these testimonies were, however, cannot be said for lack of further sources. It is hardly a coincidence that this epithet disappears at the latest with a change to the Aramaic orthography of Yahweh, though one cannot not be ultimately sure about the reason. Conceivably, but less likely, is that this term was simply no longer understood within the Yahweh community and therefore became obsolete. Rather, it is to be thought that this is a matter of an approximation of the Yahweh community to its environment, with which not only the general prevailing orthography was taken over, but also a God designation, probably incomprehensible for this environment, was renounced. It cannot even be ruled out that the designation of Yahweh as Yahweh of the hosts met with rejection within a multi-religious mercenary community, since it could give the appearance that Yahweh claimed to be the God of the entire troop. Of course, this would certainly have been a misunderstanding, but with the abandonment of this term, corresponding conflicts could be avoided. You know, in conflicts with religions, you take every argument you can get, even if it's wrong. Yahweh, however, stayed not without new epithets, which, however, are attested only from the last quarter of the 5th century. First, Elah Shammaya, the god of the heavens, should be mentioned here. At first glance, this could be seen as a simple substitution of Yahweh Tsabaoth, insofar as Tsabaoth can refer to the heavenly hosts. However, an analysis of the use of this epithet argues against this assumption. Apart from 2 instances in the greeting form of letters within the Yahweh community, it is encountered only in context with outsiders. Thus, Ma'usya reports to the Yahweh community in A43 that the God of heaven helped the overtly non-Judean officials, Sechar and Chor, in their advocacy of him to Vidranga. Particularly significant is a carefully worded letter from the Yahweh community to Governor Bagoi, which mentions the God of heaven only in the introductory greeting to Bagoi, and in the concluding assurance that the God of heaven will bless Bagoi. Where the letter mentions Yahweh in the context of its own cult community, other terms are chosen, as we shall see in a moment. The fact that God of heaven is mostly used without Yahweh, and that this is also found in the recommendation of the governors Bagoi and Dalaya to their colleague Shames, indicates that this was obviously some kind of official designation of Yahweh, by which he could clearly be identified without giving his name, especially even or especially in the realm of the Achaemenid administration. This is very interesting. When Bago in Delaya to Persian governors write to Shamas and they speak about Yahoo, they don't say Yahoo, they say Elah Shamaya. Accordingly, for the Yahoo community, this designation was particularly connected with the Achaemenid environment, so that it appears only in formal letter elements and in context with non-Judeans. That we are dealing here with a designation that is closely connected with the Aramaic language environment of the Achaemenid reign also becomes clear when we look at the other uses of this designation. Within the Hebrew cult and theological language, it is encountered only rarely and only in texts of the Persian period and most early Hellenistic times. Already in Qumran, there is no further evidence, and in rabbinic writing, it is used rarely but consistently only in biblical references. Only in some piyutim it is occasionally found outside of clear biblical citations, but in view of the general known peculiarity of the Paitanim to use the Tanakh ad libitum as a query of phrases and terms, also here the late biblical use should be assumed as a direct source. In short, within the Hebrew cult and theologian language, this designation is only a short-lived phenomenon of the Persian time, which did not survive it in the end. Thereby, it is then also mostly not used as a stand-alone designation of Yahweh, but as a supplement of the addition to the name of God. The situation is different with regard to Aramaic text. The majority, it is almost 60% of the biblical evidence, is found in the rather small biblical Aramaic corpus. Furthermore, it's found in Targumic Aramaic, and here especially in the Palestinian Targumim, also outside the evidence given by the Tanakh. One will not be wrong with the assumption that we have to do with God of the heaven, with a designation which was introduced in Achaemenid time for Yahweh and was felt for the users in particular as belonging to the Aramaic coined area. It was not rejected, but perceived as foreign to the inherited Hebrew cult language. It is significant that in biblical Aramaic, the term basically replaces the name of Yahweh, as is largely the case in the evidence from Elephantine. But even in the Targumic evidence, the phrase is encountered in free use without the name. That is, in Aramaic-influenced usage, God of heaven was largely felt to replace the name of God and not as an additional epithet. We can only speculate about the religious historical background of the emergence of this designation of Yahweh. That behind it a pre-exilic northern Israelite expression of the Levantine Baal Shamayim stance, as Near has assumed, is unlikely and is also not covered by the sources. Rather, one can think of the fact that by such a designation, which does not simply supplements but replaces the name of Yahweh, the integration of the Yahweh cult into the Achaemenid context was made easier. The group-specific aspect of Yahweh as a God of Israel and Judah thus receded in favor of the more general designation of Yahweh as a God of heaven, which was readily connectable in a syncretic world. Yahweh could thus be interpreted as only one of many possible expressions of the heavenly deity. However, where the texts from the Yahweh community speak of their own temple, its personal or cultic activities, Yahweh is accordingly not referred as Allah Shamaya. This also applies to the text which in the formal greetings or in the address to outsiders this designation is used. Thus, as we have seen, Mausya in his letter to the leadership of the Yahweh temple, speaks of the non-Judeans Sachar and Chor successfully intervening on this behalf at Vedrania with the help of the God of heaven. The priests are called the priests of the God Yahweh. This is even clearer in the petition of the Yahoo community to Bagohi. The temple in Elephantine is not the temple of the god of heaven, but the temple of the god Yahoo. The sacrifices are offered on the altar of the god Yahoo. And the Yahoo community addresses its cultic lamentations after the destruction of the temple not to the god of heaven, but to Yahoo Mari Shamaya, Yahoo, the Lord of heaven. In this context, Lord of heaven, as opposed to God of heaven, is likely to be placed next to and probably even replaced the older and now abundant designation Yahoo Sabaoth. The lordship of Yahoo over the heavenly hosts recalls in any case the expressions Lord of heaven. If one takes this finding seriously, it emerges that the Yahoo community on Elephantine certainly did accept the designation of Yahoo as the god of heaven, but has not adopted it for the eternal sphere of its own cult. Here one still speaks of God of Yahoo, or by analogy with the obsolete designation Yahoo Sabaoth, or Yahoo the Lord of heaven, the Lord of heaven. God of heaven, besides its isolated use in formal epistolary stress, is encountered only toward representative of the Achmenic administrations. I make it a little bit shorter. It is, I think we can connect this with the appearance of the designation of the Jewish community as the Chayla Yahudaya, which is only used for this community. Once with Hananiah and once in the big list of contributors to the temples. And this is very interesting. This big list of these contributors is made of several other lists. Some of these groups are belonging to a military century. So this is obviously not a military terminology, Yahuduya, but some people from other military entities can be also part of this Chayla Yahudaya, which means that this has now got a cultic connotation. So I skip this. And this comes together with another change. If you have, we have sometimes Yehuda zi Yev or Bebera Yev or Arami zi Yev for Jewish people. And there's a clear cut in 420. Before September 420, we have only Yehuda zi Yev, and afterwards we have only Arami zi Yev. But these are the officials. Designations. And even in this, we have to read Aramaic, skip this. And that this is not a scribal habit is shown that the scribes Mausia and Haggai, 420, use this Yehudai, and after, the same scribes use Aramai. So, at this time, 420, there's a shift in meaning of Yahudai. Before you could use it just to identify a person of a dagel or something like this. But after 420, you don't use it anymore for this purpose, but then you use even for Yahudai, Aramai. So it's not more official term for belonging to the troop. I skip this. That Yahudai becomes now a cultic term is shown by the letter to Bagoi, where Yahudai is now used as those people who belong to the Yahoo community and not more to the troops. We have them now in this cultic context. Okay, let's make a conclusion. 1 minute. In retrospect, the following picture emerges. The consolidation of the Yao community around a temple on Elephantine must be dated to the time of Amasis at the latest, but may well have even older antecedents. Aspects such as the spelling of Yao with the name He, with a He, or the use of the Hebrew word Sabaoth shows that the Yao community conservatively adhered to its traditions brought from Judah and or Israel, at least in some points into the Persian period. The existence of corresponding written sources can also be assumed. The fact that also terms like Pesach are consistently treated like names in the text are not determinate and are not determinate suggests that they were also used as inherited cultic terminal techniques. We have Pesach, we have Shabbat, and not often this, like names, not Pascha, the Pesach. However, the adoption of the Aramaic orthography for the name of Yahweh, as well as the disappearance of the designation Sabaoth, which becomes visible at the latest around 450 BC, show that the younger generations modernize their tradition step by step. A decisive break in the history of the community on Elephantine was apparently then later the establishment as a Chayla Yahudaya. Now the term Yahudaya shifts a little more to, I don't want to say Jewish, but more to a religious term, around 420 in connection with the appearance of Hananiah. Possibly this was initiated by the Achaemenid site itself. We know the connection between Hananiah and Ashamas, or at least actively supported. That the Achaemenid, that it came from outside, is clear by the use now of Elasha Maya, which is foreign to their language. This development brought this community not only a new terminology, but also the hatred of the Chnum priests, which is another story. Thank you very much for your attention.
As I see them, I apologize, I'm wearing my reading glasses at the time, so if I don't see you, wave your hands wildly, it's nothing personal, okay. And, yes, sir, I don't know your names, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you, Ingo, for a very rich contribution. I wrote down most of what you said. Well, not most of what you said, but the main lines of what you said was hard because you said a lot. So let me pick just one thing out of this, the writing of the Yahoo name. I've been struck in the past by the fact that you find the same, you suggested it was Judean with the hey at the end, I think.
Judean or Israelite.
Okay. Because I was going to point out that you find the same phenomenon with city names, like Megiddo and Jericho.
Yes, it's common in the Palestinian era in the 7th, 6th century to write final O with he, and you don't have it with Vav there.
Okay, but you're not suggesting that this means that it can only have come from Judea.
No.
Okay, good. By the way, well, that's good for me, yes. But no, by the way, it's also interesting to think that these Megiddo and Jericho are theophoric city names, with the O probably meaning place of or something like that. And that would be an interesting view also to approach the significance of Yahoo, which occurs for the first time in an Egyptian text, probably for a place, as a place name. Okay, that's all.
Yeah. Thanks, Ingo. It's always a pleasure to hear the way you're thinking about these texts. I I want to complicate a little bit the evidence that you were talking about when it comes to the ostraca in particular. You, as well as the previous paper and a lot of citations, just follow Neve's passing comment that these are dated to the first quarter of the 5th century with no evidence ever provided for this. And Lozach-Muir has been the only one who's done a serious paleographic study and argued against it. How would just not dating or not giving this rigid date to the ostraca affect your schematic here?
I'm a little bit puzzled because Lozach-Muir, especially for those, always plays in the first quarter. Even Lozach-Muir, they are all 1A, 1B, and 1A, 1B is placed also by Lozach-Muir, or it was not herself who did it, also in this early time.
And she admits she's following Neve with reservation. And then she says the reservation is because we have this variety of script in 1A, 1.3, and all of these other,
Yes,
A3.
but from the, otherwise we would have a very short time of very strong development in the script together with the later ones.
But evidence of the same script is found on the later contracts and the signatures.
Some, yes, but not all. But you are clear. I follow here those epigraphers who worked a lot on this, and paleography is not really my stuff. So I even Lozach-Muir said, okay, they are probably from the beginning.
So, okay, I'll talk to you later, but we have two datable ones.
We have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Professor Kottsieper.
You speak of Aramaizi Svein, Aramaizi Yev as 420. Well, what do you make of the statement that the Jews say Svein Kanin?
There are Sunit use, and probably this. Thank you very much. This was in one slide of which I just skipped. Interesting, we have Aramaic of the Aramaics of Jeb, but we still have Yahudites in Svein. And this is very interesting. We have one instance, maybe I find one instance, this letter here, don't find it so fast, where the same person is in a document.
Aramaizi Yev and Yehudai Yev and Aramaizi Yev or Svein or Yev?
No, let me continue. We have a very instance that the one and the same person in the one and the same year by a scribe from Syene is called in Syene, written in Syene, simply a Yahudai, but by a different scribe on Elephantine, he is called Aramai Bas Yev. 402. So outside of Elephantine, they still work with the old Yahudai terminally. On Elephantine, and this is one idea, that on Elephantine, in the context of this Yahoo community, they avoid now this term. Outside, it was no problem.
only a small remark about the Tzava'ot, just to complete the documentation. It's not that significant, I believe. There is also in Akkadian the name Manu Ki Tzabeh. It's late, it's the first millennium, although it looks perfectly Akkadian, might have some Aramaic. It's also explicable in Aramaic terms. So the epithet Tzabeh is also exists, a divine epithet, exists in at least in late Akkadian.
Is this really, or is this Akkadian? You have Tzaba'ah in Akkadian as...
It's not exactly the semantic, the semantics is a bit different, but it is the same etymon after all.
It's the same, but we
Yeah.
have this,
And
we have this word Tzaba'ah in Akkadian.
No, but it's the same etymon. The same root. It's the
Yes.
same word. Yeah.
Yeah, but we have
And
this...
it is in the same place where you put the divine name, Manuki and then DN, divine name. But in this case, they used an epithet.
Yes, but in Akkadian, we have this Tzaba'ah, so this Daba'ah would become in Akkadian
Tzabu.
Tzaba'ah.
Yeah, Tzabu. Yeah.
Tzabu.
Okay.
So...
So thank you very much, Ingo, just for this truly rich presentation. Just to add to what Ron Tzadok just said, there's also a Reshef Tzavai in the Ugaritic. So that's another, a little bit different, but it is a divine name with the Tzavaot. So that's also an interesting parallel. I just wanted to add that to what Ron said, and no question. Thank you.
Our